Greetings, I'm Pastor John from NCCP UMC. I'm glad you found this edition of NCCP On Demand. It is October 2014 and we are beginning a brand new series on evangelism called Sharing Faith. Now, before you get too excited or too worked up when you hear that word evangelism and you turn us off, hold on a second. Because we're looking at it from a different approach to what we might otherwise think of when we hear that word evangelism. First of all, you'll feel a little bit uneasy because most of us, me included, don't have the gift of evangelism. And then number two, even if we do, or regardless of our gift of evangelism, we've been burned in society by evangelists. And what I mean by that is not all evangelists are bad, and certainly there's a lot of gifted evangelism that goes on in our midst. But a lot of times we've been harmed by evangelism, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So that makes us feel uneasy. Not to mention people just knocking on our doors when unsolicited, or people in the marketplace standing up on a box. But all those aside, we'll get to those later. But first I want to give thanks to Pastor Pete Briscoe, and he is in Texas. And he's the one that kind of turned us on to this idea of sharing faith, or sharing life, sharing faith through sharing life, and or at least gave it a name. And so we give thanks for him and some of his concepts that we're using here. And so just to get us started with that, Pastor Pete says that in the beginning of his call at his church, and he had been there about 25 years when he said this, but he had this church setting where he could think back and how exciting it was at the very beginning of the church. And what made it so exciting was that they had all these new believers that were coming to their church. And with new believers, there's new energy and new excitement. But over the years, they discovered that that had waned, and that, yeah, they were still getting new people, but not new believers. And so the excitement and enthusiasm kind of had worn down. And in fact, they discovered they had become a holy huddle, a closed circle or a closed net. And so that was starting to affect things. He really noticed it as he was looking for a story for his Christmas message about a conversion, a personal conversion. And he had told a story or thought of a story, but it was the same story that he had been telling over and over again. And the story about this one particular converted person was 15 years old. He was like, wow, we need some new stories. And so through that process, what they discovered quickly was that in order to get some new stories, they needed some new people, some new conversions. In order to get new conversions, they had to care about other people. They had to care about those who didn't know Christ. And that had become a problem because they had become apathetic. His church had become apathetic. And so they needed a heart change. And so at the essence of this first session, this introduction to evangelism we call sharing life, that's the main point. We need a heart change. And in his case, his particular case, his church, he was saying is because they were apathetic. And that may be the case, and certainly was for them. And it may be the case for some of us, where we just have become so locked in on our own issues, our own problems personally, or as a family, or a community, or as a church, that we just don't have time to care, or we just don't care like we used to about other people. But I also see maybe another strand of this same problem, and that is not that we don't care, but that we care too much, maybe about culture and society in terms of we get so angry and mad at unbelievers. And so we're not reaching unbelievers because we don't care. We're not reaching unbelievers or new believers because we get so mad and so angry. And we blame the world's problems, society and culture, on the unbelievers. If they would only believe, our world would be a better place. If they'd only allow prayer here and there, our world would be a better place. And it's our way of not taking responsibility. The world is in its condition, or our community is in its condition, because of all of us. And certainly, if we don't want to go down the road of pointing fingers, number one, it's not biblical. Remember the whole speck in the eye thing? And number two, Christians behave poorly and badly just as much as unbelievers. And so it's not fair to throw them under the bus. But a lot of times, that anger and that madness, when it engulfs us, it is counterproductive in the least. And it's certainly not helping bring in unbelievers. And so we're going to look over the next month at ways where we can have a heart change, where we can be less angry, where we can care more about people who might not know anything about faith in Jesus the Christ. And so we're going to talk about ways that we can do that, and in a different way. One of the ways to illustrate this anger is that if you're on social media, if you're on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, whatever, you may have come across this video of this guy, and the video picture, usually the still photo of the video is this guy. He's up in the camera real close, and he looks so mean. I think he has a baseball cap on backwards, but I might be dreaming that part. I think he has a beard like me, but it's not me. But anyway, the title of the video is "Watch This Man Destroy the Atheist," or "Destroy the whoever." And regardless of what he says in that video, to be honest, I didn't even watch it. Just the title turned me away. But because regardless, he might be saying all the right things. I don't even know, and I don't care, because he comes across so mean and so angry that the atheist isn't going to care what he has to say. He's going to say, man, who is this guy claiming to be a Christian, a follower of Christ, who is about love and peace and grace, and he doesn't seem to exhibit any of that towards his audience. And so he might destroy, quote unquote, the atheist with his words, but he's not being helpful in terms of having a conversation that may plant a seed of conversion in that person's heart. And so that's just one small example, but that's the way we come across in the world for many people who otherwise might want to listen to what we have to say, but they never get beyond the anger that's coming out of us. And so we want to look at it a different way. And so we need a heart change, in other words. We need a heart that is softened for the world, not angry at the world. And just briefly, I'm going to give you some homework so I don't go through this on a video portion. But what we would look at is the Gospel of Luke. We give you 2 places in Luke to read for homework. Chapter 19, first of all. And this is the part where Jesus is coming into Jerusalem for the last time. He's going to face his death in a few chapters here. But as he comes in to Jerusalem, the Pharisees get angry because everybody's shouting out and they're recognizing, really for the first time, who Jesus is. And Jesus has that great line in this part, and he says, I tell you, if these were silent, if my followers, if this parade route was silent, the stones would shout out. And I just think that's a great line there, that even if we don't do our part, the stones would shout out. But the part that I really want you to look at in chapter 19 is what comes next. What comes next is, as he came near and saw the city, he wept over it. He wept over it. Jesus wept. And so what he wept about was that he says, we get this, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace. If they would have just recognized, they could have avoided the destruction and all the pain that's coming to Jerusalem that's going to unfold. If they would have only recognized. And his heart broke for that. Our heart has to break in order for our heart to change. Our heart has to break for the things that breaks God's heart in order to be changed, in order to be not just care about unbelievers, but also to have a warm heart towards unbelievers. Quit destroying unbelievers and loving unbelievers and sharing life with them. And so, Jesus wept because he knew of what was coming. He wept because he didn't want anybody to perish or to be destroyed. His whole mission was to come so that no one would perish, John 3:16 says. He came so the world could be saved, not destroyed. And so Jesus wept about that, and we have to weep for the same things. And in worship, we talked about all the ways that perishing can look like. Perishing can look like the flood in the Noah story. The Gospels also, perishing can look like heat and fire. And that's another place I want to give you for homework. Luke chapter 16, we have this great conversation between the rich man and the poor man and Abraham. And the rich man goes to hell and the poor man's in heaven. So read that story, Luke chapter 16, about that, because perishing can look like heat and fire. And that story will break your heart in order for you to get a heart change, and break my heart. And so Jesus was heartbroken over Jerusalem. And that's really where we need to get if we're going to set ourselves up for doing a good job of sharing faith by sharing life. And so the good news, the bad news is that's a reality, is that some will perish, some will be destroyed. But it's not our job to do the destroying. That's a biblical concept, that God is a God that's going to judge the world. And so that's the bad news. And the bad news are there's consequences for that hell is real. And so that is a reality, but that should break our hearts, not make us mad at the world. It should break our hearts. And if it breaks our hearts, then our hearts can change, and then we'll be set up to sharing life. Because the good news is really, really good. The good news is that God doesn't want anybody to perish. And that's why he sent Jesus to die for our sins. And Paul talks about that, and the scriptures talk about that. The Gospels talk about that. And so it's just that is what the gospel is all made up to be. And so our hearts must break in order to change. That's this concept. That's this part one of this sharing life style of evangelism, is that we have to have a heart for the unbeliever, and it can't be an angry heart. And so for homework this week, I want all of us to pray that God will break our hearts for the things that break God's heart, number one. And then number two, to read those scriptures that we reference. First of all, the Luke 16, or excuse me, the Luke 19, where emphasizing that Jesus wept over Jerusalem on his entry. And then Luke 16, looking at that story of the rich man, poor man, and Abraham having the conversation in order to really break our hearts, to set us up for sharing life. And then when we come back next week, what we're going to discover is a way, and you really get to the core at what it means to share life with a little L, sharing life, little L, in order to fall in love with people, in order to build trusting relationships, and what that looks like ultimately in terms of sharing life with a capital L. And so I look forward to coming back next week and sharing that with you. In the meantime, pray that God breaks our hearts in order that our hearts can change. And let's not go out and destroy anyone this week. Let's go out and see who we can love. And so thank you for joining NCCP On Demand. I look forward to seeing you next week in the name of Christ. Amen.